principle at all, because the idea of a principle is that you're supposed to pass it regardless of the consequence. On their side, the consequence is too severe. If giving money is important, they even told you that international students sometimes pay full tuition. So take them at their absolute highest ground. Even if these international students are rich students, even if they give money to these colleges, as they even say, they almost always pay full tuition. However, there are cases in which they don't pay full tuition, but in the cases in which they do, they're still contributing to these colleges. If the problem that you have with the status quo is basically that international students don't pay their colleges, that simply isn't true. They're paying them in the status quo, not only through colonialism for the past generations, but also in the status quo through tuition money. But then they seem to be very obsessed with the idea in the first POI of open borders. So yeah, we do support open borders. Yeah, we do support open visas. This is not a reason to stand against side opposition's principle. This is simply building up our own principle, and they never provide you any warranted analysis as to why our principle is bad. We don't hear real responses from side proposition with regards to our principle. And sure, the status quo isn't perfect, but we're saying that it's much, much better than side proposition's world. But then moving into who best supports the best education for not only international students, but also domestic ones. So basically, in the status quo, they would like to say that it's absolutely horrendous because international students are being prioritized and domestic ones are not. However, in order to change that, you simply have not been able to prove why you should. Here's a couple reasons why. First, the status quo does not prioritize anyone, and both international and domestic students can get spots. But then, Proposition refused this by saying, sure, but all international students are rich, so basically they're taking away spots from domestic students. But as Jack already explained to you, there are two different pools of international and domestic students. Just because an international student who might be rich takes a spot in a college does not mean that they're taking that spot away from a poor domestic student. But furthermore, we also told you that that's just not true. Not all international students are rich. In fact, a minority of them are rich. And even if they aren't rich, there are things like scholarships. There's things like financial aid that these colleges provide these students. But they also say that colleges are not always fully funded by the state. In fact, as Elise says, that they have to make profit in the first place. The way that they make that profit is through international students. They are contradicting themselves with this point, because if you want these colleges to continue to exist and continue to make profit, further the quality of their education, you have to have people who pay these colleges full tuition, which in this case are the international students. I'll take a point.
If college's main avenue to build up this profit is through international students, then why are they going to accept poor international students in the first place?
So we think that there's a minority of students who are international students who are rich. However, we do accept that there are some international students who are rich, and in those cases, they do pay full tuition. But that full tuition is funding the domestic students and giving them the aid directly because they are re-contributing it to these domestic students. But in fact, we also take them at their highest ground, saying that international students, even if they are rich, still contribute to the education quality. Furthermore, they say that they want to help the host country. They don't want to take their resources away, in this case, which is students. They don't want brain drain. But actually, side opposition is who helps the host country the absolute most. Because, as Jack says, these international students go back to their host country because they can't stay in their college country, especially since visas aren't forever. You have to get citizenship, and citizenship is not rewarded based off of merit. They would rather return to their own home country with the resources and the knowledge that they have gained from their study abroad and apply it to not only the economy, but also their government. They give examples of 95% of Indian international students not coming back, but we think this is a cherry-picked example, especially since the most of India's economy is only focused on tech, and they're leaving that country to get jobs based off of tech. But even if they don't return, they're still going to send money back to their families, as Jack already explained to you. So for the domestic universities of the host country, they only get help on the opposition's world because these students return to their country. They not only help out the government, but they also help out the economy. They further the quality of education in these countries, and we think that is absolutely crucial in today's world. They also say that international students will crowd out domestic ones, but as as we already explained to you, those are two separate pools. It's not an either-or situation. We simply have to understand that side proposition wants to prioritize domestic students. We want to make sure that the playing field is absolutely even, especially for the people who have continued to be hurt by colonial countries in the status quo, who are developed countries, who are hurting these developing countries and the people inside of them. We on side opposition understand that education is one of the most important things in our world. And that's why we are very proud to oppose, because side proposition does not understand that prioritizing domestic students inherently is discrimination. They do not understand that you cannot discriminate regardless of your socioeconomic status. You cannot discriminate regardless of the nation in which you were born in, and you cannot discriminate regardless of the skin color that you have. We understand on side opposition that that is the most important factor in today's debate. Very proud to oppose.
Speaker for her fine speech. Now I invite the reply speakers to conclude the debate. First is the opposition reply. Stage is yours. You have 4 minutes.
Few reasons why we have won this debate, but prefacing them is the importance of the burden we've given you throughout this entire round. Just reminding you that the basis on your decision for this round must be under the grounds that they have to prove very significant principal injustices as well as practical harms for you to consider voting for them. Otherwise, you will always err on the side that does not make a discriminatory decision on the ground that they've conceded. It does violate people's rights to equality and things of that nature, so you always err on the side that does not discriminate. With that said, let's look at why not only have they not met their role under this burden, but we've actually wound up winning most of these clashes. Beginning with the practical, the most important idea here for most of the debate was brain drain. Now, why was this the case? This is the argument where most of their material says that these people will leave their their developing home countries and leave them bereft of resources. Now, we think the exact opposite is true, but this stakeholder, we believe, is uniquely key, the reasoning for which being that poverty within these developing countries is much worse than within developed countries. It's intergenerational and it's vicious. We think this is the first stakeholder that you consider within this debate. So let's go on to why exactly we win this round. We have said that when you look at the warranting, these individuals do come back to their home countries after they receive elite educations within developed countries. Why did we say this was the case? First, things like close ties at home, but also things like the inherent incredible difficulty of obtaining permanent residency within these new countries in which they stay. There's not a clear answer from that beyond this floating number that Miles doesn't really give any sort of citation for. But moreover, we say that if they do obtain some sort of visa, which is the only merit-related way that you can stay in a country, it is, first of all, only applying in a vast minority of cases. But second of all, and this is really important, work visas are only temporary. They expire in a few years, which still guarantees that these individuals return to their countries of origins with work experience and financial ties, which only magnifies our benefits. That's why their India statistic is talking about visas. We see it's incredibly beneficial when these individuals come back to their countries. And the reason for that is because they have much more economic capital, they have more power to pressure the government, and also they can reform things like the educational system. They break the intergenerational cycle of poverty by bringing new connections with the financial industry and new innovations back to their country. But even if we take them at their highest ground, why do we still win this argument? The first argument we made is on remittances. Even if these individuals do not come back, they make so much more money in their new countries that they can then send remittances back, almost all immigrants do this, and raise huge amounts of their families out of poverty. But the other thing they've conceded is the when. We see that if we continue in their world and don't let international students escape the institutions in which they are raised, there is no way to change the status quo regarding the quality of these educational institutions. There's not been an answer to that weighing, so ultimately, on the most important issue, the only way you can solve it is by voting for us. The next issue on the practical is this issue about helping out domestic students. Now, while it seems both sides agree this is a somewhat less important stakeholder, we see a couple of things become evident. Firstly, we argue that universities need to accept a certain number of high-income students because they can only give out a certain amount of aid. They have a finite budget, so they can only accept so many students that pay that budget. that means that if you accept one more upper income student, that does not trade off with the amount of lower income students you accept, because you have to meet a budget, they're not in competition. Now this is very important because it means that international students do not push out the other students who actually need the money. There was never a clear answer to this argument from their side of the house, but moreover, we think that even if their characterization is true and international students do ultimately have a lot of money, then they subsidize the education of those other students at which they're working with. But we also think, like, how rich are they? That discussion wasn't very fruitful in this round. Lastly is the question of the principle. We give you the argument of colonialism, how the mass amounts of exploitation means governments in developed countries have a very high obligation to those in developing countries. Now here's the important weighing that Genevieve does that wins us the round. Even if their entire social contract argument is correct, the degree of exploitation and destruction that the developing world has received, like, through generations is much more powerful than the government's need to compensate you for having your parents pay taxes a few years ago. This need to redress this devastating global harm is much stronger than the principled need, ultimately on their side of the house, to just, like, for some reason, allow you to, like, maybe have a chance of attending the university your parents paid for. We think it's very clear that you're voting for the opposition.
I thank the speaker for his fine speech, and I invite the last speaker to conclude the debate from the side of proposition. Stage is yours.
I set up very clearly in my 2 that the comparative in this debate is either international students are going to a host country for a set amount of time to get an education in a different country, or there's going to be direct investment into the education systems in the countries these students are coming from. We think that this is the most important analysis. This is the 2 scenarios you want to choose between. 2 things in this speech. First, is there an obligation to prioritize citizens? Second, who best helps the developing nations? On the first question, we think there very clearly is an obligation to protect the citizens. I explained how the social contract is much farther than just tuition in my 2. Miles carried this in his 3. We said that it's taxation, not just the tuition to the university itself. This is long-term, meaning that these citizens would be helping everyone else within the country, not just the individuals who go to that university. But Miles also explained how when you have things like open visas under the opposition rule, that's actually going to have the same problems that they try to push on us. If you just have unlimited open visas, meaning everyone can come to that country, all of the same arguments about resources being finite is cross-applicable, meaning that you can't push this to practicality. They keep pushing the standard on us, saying that we have to show the unique harms of having prioritization of these domestic students. We think we have shown you this unique harm because of the comparative trade-off. There wasn't a lot of analysis coming from the opposition explaining why their comparative is going to be better. At the end of the day, the majority of this debate ended up taking place on the practical, so let's look at who helps developing countries. We think these international students are always going to be the rich. We gave you a lot of analysis for this. They tell you, well, you don't have to be rich to be smart, maybe, but it really, really helps to be rich because you have to have a lot of investment, time into testing, you have to know the knowledge of the systems. Miles tells you have to have enough money to travel to the new country in the first place. We think this is going to be the highest socioeconomic class. And then the third speaker tells you that this is international students is how universities make money in the first place. That's actually a narrative that carried down the bench. Universities always have the incentive to prioritize these rich international students. But moreover, when we look at the countries that these students are coming from, brain drain is almost inevitable. We gave you the 5% statistic of Indian citizens actually returning to India after they get their science degree, and we gave you incentive analysis as to why they're not going to return home. First of all, we told you that they had connections that they've created in colleges, and second, they have more job opportunities. But let's say at the end of the day, you call this part of the debate not more of a wash. Miles also tells you why this is going to be preferable on our side of the house, why our characterization is more likely to be true. Even if you buy the opposition analysis saying that visas are going to be temporary, Miles told you that they can be extended, or naturalization because the country wants these individuals to stay is also a possibility. Both of these things don't really go responded to in the opposition bloc. But let's look very clearly at the comparative. They told you that these universities are always going to want the best and the brightest from the international community. Let's say, even taking the opposition on the highest ground, that these are poor individuals. It's still taking the brightest out of those countries' origin. That means the states have less incentive to invest in their own education systems. This incentive analysis was never responded to. That means the education systems within these countries that the students are coming from are never going to be built up because these individuals don't have the incentive to try and keep students within their own countries because they know the student is just going to leave and go to somewhere in the developed world. We don't think that remittances were enough to get out of this debate. Instead, we prefer to pay reparations for things like colonialization, which they keep saying we never responded to, is direct investment into the countries that they say have a problem in the first place. Mija, this is why we win the debate. We told you that the comparative was the most important part. Our comparative has long-term success in every instance because we are creating long-term sustainability within the countries that these students are coming from. Meaning it's not only the rich that benefit who would otherwise go to a different country. It's the education system, it's the country as a whole.
I thank the speaker for her fine speech. I thank all the debaters for this fine debate. You may now shake your hands, and we'll ask you to leave the room for 2 minutes so we can reach a decision. Thank you very much. We'll call you in when the decision is ready.
We have to do I just got major data boosts.
There you go.